Our final panel for today is going to be on integrating risk assessment and risk management. Our moderator is Kara Morgan, who's from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Hello, everyone. Our panelists are well aware that they are what is standing between you and cocktails. But luckily, we have, I think the scheduling was great and that we have a topic that has lots of interest. And panelists will be engaged in discussion and debate that I think will make the time go quickly. So with that, our panel is on integrating risk assessment and risk management. Better integration of science, economics, and decision-making has long been a significant concern in regulation. Most recently, the National Research Council report, Science and Decisions, Advancing Risk Assessment, made several recommendations for changing how these issues are addressed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These recommendations, as well as preceding proposals and newer ideas for fundamental change, have significant implications for how environmental and numerous other risks are assessed and regulated. And to start our panel today, we have Gail Charnley, who is a principal at Health Risk Strategies.
Thank you. 4 o'clock is usually kind of my lull time of the day. Hopefully my presentation won't put me to sleep. I'd like to focus my comments this afternoon on human health risk assessment and management involving environmental and occupational chemical exposures, because that's what I'm most familiar with. And new ideas in the regulation of risks in this area, of course, borrow from and contribute to the management of risks in other areas. And I think it's helpful to run through a little background on the evolution of new ideas in this area to kind of set the stage. Quantitative human health risk assessment involving chemical exposures was developed so that regulatory agencies could fulfill the qualitative statutory requirements for public health protection that have been thrust upon them. Things like having a reasonable certainty that no harm will result, and to provide an ample margin of safety to protect public health without being arbitrary and capricious. So for years, the regulatory risk community figured that has adhered to the now somewhat antediluvian notion that first you scientists generate toxicity and exposure data, and they hand that off to the risk assessors, and the risk assessors assess the risk, and then they hand that off to the risk managers, and they manage the risk. That was then, and this is now, thanks to a variety of National Academy of Sciences and other committees that have been convened over the last 10 to 15 years or so. We finally figured out that you don't have to first kill a lot of rats and then give your data to gratefully awaiting risk assessors, who then give their risk assessments to gratefully awaiting risk managers, who then figure out what to do. What we finally figured out is that risk assessment exists at the pleasure of risk management. Or, as the Understanding Risk Committee put it so nicely in 1996, risk characterization should be a decision-driven activity directed towards informing choices and solving problems. Not to be outdone, in 1997, Bernie Goldstein and the Commission on Risk Assessment and Risk Management created a whole new environmental health risk management decision-making framework based on the notion that in order to make a decision, you have to start by characterizing a problem in its risk management context, preferably with lots of stakeholder input, and then tailor your risk assessment to address your particular problem in its context. The nice people who study risks from radioactive wastes concurred in 2005, recommending a 6-step process for risk-informed decision-making that starts out with defining a problem, and then identifying options and potential risk management decisions. That committee emphasized that the process is meant to be a comparative exercise, not one that sets out to prove that a particular alternative does not pose unacceptable risk. The Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century Committee recommended in 2007 that the design of toxicity tests should be cognizant of the risk management context in which their results would ultimately be used. And finally, the Science and Decisions Committee concluded just recently that risk assessment should be viewed as a method for evaluating the relative merits of various options for managing risk rather than an end in itself, and recommended a three-step approach to risk management decision-making that starts out with problem formulation and scoping and by laying out possible risk management options. And the role of risk assessment here then is to evaluate the relative merits of the risk management options under consideration, and I'm sure that's what Adam is going to tell us all about a little later. So as you can see, there's been an evolution of recommendations over the years that is encouraging us to start risk management decision-making not with toxicity testing or risk assessment, but by developing a clearer understanding up front of the risk problem we are trying to solve, along with potential means of solving it, and then targeting our science and analysis in ways that help us decide how best to solve it. One of the other things that the Risk Commission recommended in its report in 1997, among about 75 other things, that I think is relevant to this discussion is that risks to human health should be evaluated using a public health approach to risk management. And Bernie Goldstein and I have written a paper about this as well. And what we mean by a public health approach is one that emphasizes prevention instead of cleaning up after the fact, and that focuses on the effectiveness of actions instead of on regulatory command and control. A public health approach works from the top down instead of the bottom up by evaluating the adverse health effects experienced by a population, in other words, scoping the problem up front, then identifies possible causes of those effects, and then seeks to determine the relative contribution of each cause to the effects. In other words, targets the analysis in ways that both characterize the problem and helps identify potential interventions. In this way, risk management actions can themselves be targeted in ways that are both effective and efficient. Over the last 35 years, the traditional command and control, risk by risk, chemical by chemical approach to environmental health protection has worked well to greatly improve the quality of our air and water and food and workplaces and so forth. But now we're left with the more intractable, complex problems such as urban air pollution, climate change, cleaning up Chesapeake Bay, that the traditional approach is less likely to solve. Continuing the improvements of the last 35 years will depend on our ability to look at risks collectively instead of one at a time. We need to get beyond the current chemical by chemical, medium by medium, risk by risk approach dictated by current statutes and refocus our priorities by taking a broader view. Instead of continuing to argue about what numerical regulatory standards should be set for each individual chemical, we should be asking what exposures are posing the most immediate threats to our health and our environment, and how can we control them? In other words, we need a public health approach to risk management. In the U.S., some $100 to $150 billion are apparently spent annually on environmental regulatory protection and compliance. But we have very little by which to judge the impact of this tremendous investment on public health protection and improvement in terms of actual data. Eliminating lead in paint and gasoline and installing basic air pollution controls has clearly contributed to a huge reduction in childhood lead exposure and in respiratory disease morbidity in the U.S., but beyond those two examples, we have little to show in terms of a relationship between regulation of chemical contaminants and public health improvement. And yes, I get that a lot of people in this room devote their careers to estimating the likely benefits of our investments in environmental regulation as the regulations are promulgated. But what I'm talking about here is our actual measurable data assessing public health outcomes that do or do not result from regulation. That evaluation step in the Risk Commission's framework. And this is a point that was also made by the gentleman from the OECD this morning. In fact, studies in the U.S. have found that in places where the parameters that we use to characterize the environment, reportable industrial releases, air quality, water quality, and so forth, where those parameters have shown dramatic improvement, the quality of public health is often dismal. We have to question the effectiveness of how our risk management resources are targeted if little impact on public health can be measured. It seems to me that in order to target our resources more effectively over the next several decades, we're going to have to demonstrate that they are having an impact, that they are, in fact, improving public health. Until then, our understanding of the many sources of risk to our health and our environment remains speculative to a great extent, allowing those with conflicting policy agendas to interpret the available science and analysis as they choose. So until we can make real connections between environmental exposures and public health outcomes, the extent to which we can rely on science and analysis in risk management will remain controversial. So I'm not sure that what I've been talking about constitutes new ideas for risk regulation exactly, because it turns out that a lot of these have been around for a while, albeit evolving and improving. It's that implementation thing that we seem to be having a problem with. So how exactly do we implement a public health approach, or more generally, a risk management decision-making process that starts by characterizing a problem and then uses analysis to choose among risk management alternatives? I think there are two main impediments to effective implementation and several potential solutions. First, it all depends on how you define what the problem is. If you look at EPA's annual performance reports, you see that the agency sets its goals and reports its progress in terms of enforcement actions, permitting, and the number and stringency of chemical-specific standards that have been set. The implication is that these activities are protecting and improving public health, but there are no attempts to demonstrate such impacts, if any. Of course, there really aren't much in the way of data that could be actually used to demonstrate such impacts at this point, and what we need is a nationwide public health surveillance network to generate the data that are needed to facilitate making connections between environmental exposures and public health outcomes. And the National Children's Study, I think, is a promising step in that direction. And as work in the areas of toxicogenomics and pathway-based toxicity testing matures, we may be able to, we may come to have better tools for collecting such data as well. Where am I? So in any case, it seems to me that in its role administering the Government Performance and Results Act, OMB could encourage the redefinition of EPA's goals and achievements in terms of public health and encourage the data generation needed for such accountability. Second, there are statutory constraints. For example, EPA is required to implement statutes such as, take for example, the Safe Drinking Water Act, that requires the agency to come up with a list of chemical contaminants each year and perform risk assessments to set drinking water standards for each chemical. The statute doesn't ask EPA to determine whether drinking water contaminated by chemicals is having an impact on public health in the U.S., and, if it does, to identify which chemicals or other contaminants should be controlled, come up with options for controlling them, and then target risk assessments to help choose which options would be most desirable in terms of achieving stated public health risk management goals. On the other hand, the statute doesn't prohibit that either. Presumably, OIRA, in its role assessing the effectiveness of regulation, could use a more public health-oriented definition of effectiveness in order to encourage such a focus. So these are not really new ideas, but hopefully if we keep talking about them, maybe someday they will become common knowledge, and then we will be able to move forward in a way that actually protects and improves public health. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Next, we have Bernie Goldstein, who's a professor of environmental and occupational health at the University of Pittsburgh, and also was a former assistant administrator in the EPA Office of Research and Development.
Oh, thanks, Kara. I've actually changed my talk when I saw that I was speaking after Gail and before Adam. Basically, I'm planning to be a straight man for Adam Finkel, who has served recently on a really important and superb National Academy Committee, which put out a book called Science and Decisions, which I know Adam will be speaking about, and really is informed the formation of this panel. And I'm going to be talking a bit about what I think are the potential problems with that. We frame this as the integration of risk assessment and risk management, and I basically said, well, let's be careful about that. As I do this, the three themes I'm going to work into it are that, and it's been said often by various people here, that basically risk assessment to me is simply an actionable indicator. It's got to be something you can take action on, and that's really what we want to have with almost any, whether it be a measurement of almost any kind, certainly an economic measurement. There tends to be an exaggeration by risk assessors of the importance of risk assessment. There's an exaggeration by economists of the importance of economics. I mean, it just comes with the turf. Now, I'm going to tell you why public health is important. I'm a public health person, but I'm not going to exaggerate, of course. Gail's already told you about this. One thing I will do is to try to contrast this meeting with a meeting I was at about a month ago in Cincinnati it's a joint EPA, Armed Forces, and ATSDR, CDC, Center for Environmental Health meeting, which they have each year, which is on toxicology and risk assessment. And this year was titled Toxicology and Risk Assessment in the Trenches. And I will tell you that this 2.5-day meeting and this meeting we're having right now, the previous one in Cincinnati, this meeting, have absolutely no overlap whatsoever. I mean, basically, we're talking about completely different issues. The folks in the trenches would not recognize most of what you're talking about. Most of the issues that we have here simply are not really that relevant for people who are interpreting the data. And I would argue that one of the failings of this otherwise excellent document on science and decisions is that there's really no problem statement which allows one to fix on what's the problem with risk assessment and to whom. For the risk assessor in the trenches, I will tell you that most of the time that they use risk assessment simply does not even get to public attention. Most of the time they're using the IRIS database as a way to say, well, gee, you know, there's something out there, we've got some data on something. Is it something I need to pursue? Or someone's called to say, well, I wonder about some potential issue. Should I pursue this? These are busy people. They have lots of priorities to deal with. The risk assessment that they have through IRIS that's out there is something that they use basically for priority setting, for deciding whether to start on something or not. On the other hand, we're dealing, for the most part, with very mature risk assessment problems. The problems listed in the document, as far as I could see, were really sort of in passing. They were trichloroethylene, formaldehyde, and dioxins, of course. And what I'm going to try to do is to discuss why the inherent problems with risk assessment as a measuring tool inevitably mean that you're going to have compounds of that nature being a problem. This confusion, if you will, also extends to the kind of problems that we see in lots of different areas. So I'm going to basically argue that if in fact, if risk management is broke, why fix risk assessment? And this is, I wrote this paper years ago, and Adam, for some reason, remembered it. I can't even find it in my files. But basically, the issue is we've got problems. Why is it that we seem to be focusing on fixing risk assessment? And I went and looked that term up, and it's attributed to Bert Lance, who some of you remember was Jimmy Carter's crony, who he brought to Washington to head OMB. Had some problem with some ethical and financial issues and left. There's a quote that I think that fits in from Adam and my discussion and the panel's discussion beforehand, which I think is a very good one. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's the slogan of the complacent, the arrogant, or the scared. It's an excuse for inaction, a call to non-arms. And basically, I think that from our discussion, Adam, you would argue that that's really, in a sense, what's driving a lot of the discussions about risk assessment. How can we make it better? We don't have to prove it's broken. We just need to be able to make it better. I happen to like this third one better. If it ain't broke, the government will fix it until it is. and I truly worry that that's what may happen from some of the things that are done. So what is the problem statement with risk assessment? I'm going to argue that weight of evidence approaches inherently put a line through a continuum. That inevitably the weight of evidence for some compounds will be close to the line such that minor scientific disagreement is converted into a yes-no argument. Here's a classic weight of evidence approach. Here's basically, if you will, on the left, there's a line that shows a bunch of chemicals, and with the weight of evidence going up. And what IARC has done, or any other organization has done, is to put some sort of line through that as to probably, possibly, not classifiable. Well, if there's 100,000 chemicals out there, some will always be on that line. And if we solve formaldehyde, say formaldehyde in fact was listed as probably carcinogenic, and then the evidence that it was clearly a nasal carcinogen in humans, not only in laboratory animals, and not only did you have the DNA evidence in humans and animals, basically moved it up to a 1. But now the issue is, will formaldehyde cause leukemia? There's epidemiological evidence. There's a lot of us, including myself, saying it just doesn't make any sense from a mechanistic toxicological point of view. Reasonable scientists are going to argue about that. My point is not so much about formaldehyde, but given 100,000 chemicals, some will inevitably be right at one of these lines in the weight of evidence, and reasonable scientists with small differences of opinion will put them just below or just above. That's just built into the system. And it's true for any other system that's weight of evidence. We heard a nice distinction between a catastrophe and a huge catastrophe, I think it was. I mean, that's a very useful distinction. But I'm sure if you line up potential catastrophes, wherever you want to put that line difference between huge catastrophe and catastrophe, there will be an argument about it, particularly if it's of regulatory and economic consequence to someone. So I don't see us getting rid of trichloroethylene and formaldehyde as issues. I'd also point out, and I won't bother to go through this in any detail because we always know this, extrapolation to lower risk levels than there are verifiable data is done only in response to societal decisions to be protected against low-level risks. In other words, the idea that the benzene levels in this room during the time we're here will cause us, let's say, 1 part per billion background. I can figure out what the risk is of you getting leukemia during the time that you're sitting here for this meeting just by doing a standard risk analysis. I have no way of verifying that. I have no way of knowing if, in fact, we drive 1 part per billion down to a half a part per billion to prove that the leukemia incidence in Washington will change because of that difference. We're working in extrapolating from a cloud of data that's nowhere near the level that we're at. Now, a confusion comes up, and I think it's true in the book that in Science and Decision, that when we looked at Clean Air Act pollutants, we look at ozone, we look at particulates, we're looking right within that cloud of data. We can argue as to exactly what the no observed effect level is for ozone, but we have data that reflects effects in humans at outdoor ambient concentrations for those compounds. We don't have them for lots of others, and that's inevitably going to lead to some degree of uncertainty. And finally, risk assessment is more suitable for population-based public health than it is for individual risk, and that's an issue I'll go into in more detail. I think it's worth going into because we have this kind of approach to risk assessment, which I think is perfectly appropriate for a population public health approach, but we've ended up with maximally exposed individuals as part of the rule. And, you can go through this very quickly, but basically if you have a family of four that the stealth farmers area that's used by EPA and DOE land, that has a level of 1 in 100,000 risk, and you replace this family of four, with another family of four, and they stay there 70 years, your risk is one adverse event every 1.75 million years. That's the length of time humans will be on the planet. Now, if the risk is 1 in 100,000 to the United States of America, you're talking about 3,000 people, right? That's just doing simple multiplication. That's a real problem. But this is not. And to basically force risk assessors, particularly at the local community level, to make priorities based upon absolute risk levels without looking at population at risk, I think is basically the opposite of what we want to do. We have in this new document an approach that says, well, we ought to consider cancer risk and non-cancer risk. We ought to consider threshold and non-threshold risk to all have to be non-threshold. I think that would be a real problem for local people. It's hard enough to explain safety assessment, to explain safety in a risk communication thing when we're talking about one-hit models. Now to convert everything to a one-hit model, my God, that would just make the folks who do toxicology in the trenches just unable to function when they come up with any sort of exposure whatsoever for compounds which obviously have a threshold, because safety to the public is basically zero risk. That's built into our use of the term. We've seen this, and I'm glad Gail has presented it. So let me finish. Let me end with a story about risk assessment and risk management that I only would show late in the afternoon because we got cocktails coming up and attempted some humor. This is a true story, though. In Alaska, this is a can of oleoresin capsicum, which is pepper spray. And this can is sold is sold actually in Alaska just like this, as is this can. It's exactly the same contents. One obviously showed a potential mugger. This shows a charging grizzly bear. At one point, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency banned one of these two cans. It banned this can. Because under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, or Rodenticide Act, you can't use anything in the wild without first showing its efficacy and toxicity. And no one had tested this for efficacy and toxicity. The jokes in Alaska as to which EPA employee was going to use the placebo can well, now think of it from and now this finally got laughed out and they've reversed this, but think of it from a population point of view. Grizzly bears kill 1 or 2 people a year in Alaska. There's about 500,000, 600,000 people there. If you convert that into a lifetime risk, you're dealing with a 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 10,000 risk. If you look at the amount of people who bears kill in the rest of the United States, you're dealing with a risk that's, again, 1 or 2 a year, 100 over a lifetime. You're dealing with a risk that's 1 in 3 million, say, in these round numbers. One's a really important risk. The other's a de minimis risk. Again, if you don't take those kind of things into account when you're trying to do risk assessment, if you don't really look at the context, which the science and decisions is basically saying we must do, then you're going to end up with options which are simply not meaningful to the public. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. Now we have Adam Finkel, who's a professor of environmental and occupational health at UMDNJ School of Public Health and the executive director of Penn's program on regulation at Penn Law School.
Okay. Thank you. A couple of quick caveats. First of all, I'm on day 7 of what I'm pretty sure was the new flu, so I'm trying very hard. I've not touched any food or shaken anyone's hand, but I also can't speak very well today. Secondly, I can't possibly do this in 15 minutes, so I'm glad the slides will be posted. I may go way too fast through some of the slides. And then third, Bernie, I loved your talk, but please don't put me in a position of defending a report of which I was one of 16 members. I'm going to talk about my own ideas. They are echoed to some extent in this new ANS report, but I don't even want to begin to talk about the unification of cancer and non-cancer risk assessment, or really about what that report has to say about the main idea of the talk, which is the relationship between risk assessment and risk management. With some exaggeration, I'm going to say that I have an extraordinary proposal, picking up on what Richard Williams said this morning, and so his extraordinary claim that I think he's right should require extraordinary support, which I probably can't give in 15 minutes, and maybe I can't give it at all. But it's a proposal to change the relationship between risk assessment and risk management, not in the same way that it's been proposed by this very recent report, or by the commission that Gail and Bernie worked on, or by the 2005 NS report. Incremental, but in some ways very different. So if you hate it because it's brand new, not because you hate it because it's the same old stuff. It's motivated by two really profound concerns, at least disquieting to me as a risk assessor. One, as a really unshakable proponent of risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis, I'm concerned that these tools, valuable as they are, have become sort of ends in themselves rather than tools. And as somebody who wants analysis to be central, but I equally want it to be helpful. And I think the way to do that is to harness it for its best use rather than to let it sort of grow ad lib. And then secondly, and let's get back to what Bernie said about a problem statement, that I think we're just not doing well enough. And I can't really back that up as well as I would like to, but I think it's a good challenge to turn to in the next months or years to try and take a snapshot of where we really have gotten to. But I think a lot of what Gail said about the difference between reasonably decent trend lines in concentrations of things versus what we're not seeing in terms of public health improvements gets to part of what I have in mind, that we could do a lot better. And the trend lines aren't that great either. If you look at ozone in the last 16 years, we've gotten down from an average of 83 ppb to 75 ppb. That's great, but if that's really good enough, and if we really want to stay on that trend line, then a lot of what I have to say is sort of, interesting but not necessary, because we're doing fine. I don't think we're doing fine on the workplace. I don't think we're doing fine on food safety. I don't think we're doing fine on CO2. So I think there is a problem, at least an opportunity for a call to not non-arms, but a call to arms. So one more caveat before I get to the slides. There are really two facets of this proposal. One is something I think is more palatable, which is changing sort of the theoretical way we look at these decisions, and then the probably more controversial one is some of the details about the kinds of choices that I think we ought to be entertaining. So the part that I think is not so objectionable is I think risk assessors ought to be harnessed in the service of discriminating among real choices, real options to fix problems, not just dissecting problems. And then secondly, I think as long as we might want to do that, in my view, there are some bolder, more creative kinds of solutions that we should be at least entertaining in the mix of things that we're considering. So I would characterize the old way, and I agree we are part way down an evolution away from that old way, as you get a signal of harm, and then you set people to work telling us how bad the problem is, and then you set people to work thinking the next little step in risk assessment would be, if we can characterize the harm, then how do we have to dial down the exposure in order to declare victory on that particular harm? Now, in ordinary life, if someone comes to you and says, I have a problem, ... usually what they then say is, and I don't know what to do about it. They don't say, and I need help in how to think about it. And I think that's where risk assessment has gotten. Maybe it's a risk assessor with sort of false grandiosity about how important it is, but I think it's gotten important but sort of circular and self-referential and not grounded in, I want to help you as a risk assessor decide I think what we've gotten ourselves into is I want to help you think, and that's great, but I think that's not where we need to be. So, again, the kinds of decisions that I would advocate considering are not just arraying some choices, but arraying choices in sort of the life cycle analysis speak, functional unit choices, delving deeply into industrial process, delving into lifestyle and product choices. And so we can let risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis answer questions of how can we help society fulfill the functions, dry clean our clothes, drive around from place to place, produce our goods in ways that are most able to reduce needless risks at reasonable cost, whatever your objective functions are going to be, but discriminate among technological, lifestyle, informational, market pathways rather than dissecting problems in a vacuum. So my main assertions are, first, that we're getting so far away from grounding risk assessment in decision making that we've actually started to think about decisions as what I think a decision analyst would call a pronouncement, not a decision. I think the every 5-year process of saying what the NACs shall be is colloquially a decision. It's a pronouncement. It's an end of a process, but it's neither a guidepost to getting to that number, nor is it if you are actually concerned about multiple risk trade-offs, risk versus risk, whatever you want to call holistic risk analysis. It's not a pathway to net risk reduction at all. It's a pathway towards partial risk reduction from the particular thing you happen to be controlling in that particular exercise. Now, to get to the controversial part, I think if we're going to look at choices, then not only here in the pink box here are you more likely to choose the best option if you can think your way from solutions first to analysis second, but I think the earlier in the process you're willing to array the solutions, the fewer solutions you're going to exclude because you've defined them out of the problem context. So the main heartburn I get about starting the discussion with we're going to scope out the problem is I think as soon as you start scoping the problem, you're not really scoping the opportunities for technological, lifestyle, production process, and other beneficial transformations in the way we go about producing and using goods. I'm going to have to skip that, but I think dioxin is a good example of we've made some incremental progress there, usually in the service of doing other things, but we continue to chase the tail of the decimal point on the potency and not think enough about where's this contaminant coming from. Using a mundane example, what is the best way if we had the will to mandate it, or if we just wanted to give people information about it, what are some good ways to give people a hot beverage in the morning that happens to have the least net risk from the filter medium that we use to get the hot water into the glass. A couple of other ways for people who are thinking about this issue in their own disciplines to recognize what I'm talking about by solution-focused approach. One way to think about it is taking that original Red Book paradigm and not changing the need for dialogue and the need for separation, safeguards, lack of manipulation on either end of the process, but to start with a risk management impetus rather than a risk assessment impetus. Another way to think about it is the age-old discussion of design mandates versus performance mandates that we talked about in the first panel, I think. This is admittedly more of a design-oriented way of looking at the world. It's trying to look at whether it's technologies or market incentives or information disclosure. It's trying to look at ways in which the function can be fulfilled, and that's inherently a technological or a hardware approach. Personally, I favor a hybrid approach where we're able to say to those parts of industry that actually, admittedly or not, want some guidance, want some specification. We give them a specification. We say that's a safe harbor, and we also give a performance standard and say if you can innovate and do the same level of performance any way you want, that's fine too. I don't think we've done enough of that. I think at OSHA, our ergonomics rule crashed and burned twice, really, once internally because it was too prescriptive and once externally because it was too performance-oriented. Also, it shifts attention away from, you may not remember writing it, but you wrote a brilliant little piece in the EPA Journal in 1990 that said, we're agonizing about the performance of risk assessment. I don't want to change, in this lecture, the performance of risk assessment in the details. It's about fixing the way risk managers use that information to make better use of it. I've got some disclaimers, but I think that's better in the slides. I'm probably running out of time anyway. Expected advantages, misconceptions. The main misconception, I think, is the concern about the safeguards. The original Red Book idea that we needed to keep, at least intellectually, a distinction between these two activities because we didn't want assessors playing with the data, and we didn't want managers telling the assessors what conclusions to reach. And, of course, we don't. But I think those dangers are inherent, and we need to safeguard against them, whether we start the process with managers saying, I have a decision to make, help me make it, or we start the process with assessors saying, I need 5 years to dissect the problem, leave me alone. Either way, we've got to keep the pollution, as it were, out of the picture. I don't know if anybody's seen the Simpsons movie, but there are just two brilliant vignettes in the Simpsons movie about that relationship. The first time around, the assessor provides the manager, who's the Arnold Schwarzenegger figure, having been elected president, with 3 options, and he says, I pick 3, and he says, I was elected to lead, not to read. I don't need this analysis at all. Comes back around half hour later with 5 options, and I can't reproduce it, but it's a brilliant little dialogue between the assessor, who is the head of the EPA, and the president, where the assessor basically gets the president to pick number 3 by saying, I pick 2, no, double it, I pick 4, no, a little bit less, I pick 6, no, there's no 6. And he gets him to 3 and then says, as you wish, sir. Because of course it's your decision and you did it. And I think that's some of what we risk assessors are guilty of. There are a lot of debts to the past here, decision theory, of course, cumulative risk assessment, life cycle analysis, Nick Ashford's technology options, some stuff from Wendell Berry, some stuff from Russia. Bjorn Lomborg, with whom I disagree in a lot of things, I do think, though, he's got the right idea of these exercises where the exercise is how do we spend the limited resource, how do you spend $100 billion, not which problems do we put higher up on a emotional accounting of what we should worry about the most. And that's really fundamentally what I'm trying to get to. I do think the Risk Commission made a step in this direction, but I think when they say in some cases examining the options may help, that was 12 years ago a nice breaking of the mold from where we were, but I think we need to go a little further. So I don't know where to end, but a medical analogy, my pants are too tight. Dick Zeckhauser gave a good doctor's analogy too. If you look at it as a problem to assess in a vacuum, the advice could be, get bigger pants. But if you look at that as an opportunity for rethinking fundamentally how you got in this mess in the first place, it might lead you to diet, to gastric stapling, whatever the options are. And that's where you need good analysts to help you think through the costs and benefits of all these real options to actually change the status quo rather than this thing that risk assessment has gotten good at, but which I think is not its best use, which is telling you sort of how much to worry in precise decimal points. And, of course, there are terrible concerns about statutes, to which I would say maybe someday down the road we can amend some of these statutes. I probably should stop, right? Yeah. Thank you.
And our final speaker on the panel is Sandy Hoffman. Sandy is a fellow here at Resources for the Future.
Okay, great. Well, I do want to talk about changing the performance of risk assessment, although I think what I have to say would fit equally well with a solutions-based approach to risk analysis. But I want to suggest a different take on the role of economics in risk analysis. What can you expect from an economist? What I want to suggest is a role for economics actually in risk assessment itself. To start, let's look at where we've been. In 1983, the NRC Red Book divided risk analysis into risk assessment, what we usually focus on, the portion of risk assessment and risk management. And agencies have been fairly consistent in interpreting this as a separation of risk assessment from economics and other social science analysis. What I want to spend my time talking about is why this has been a counterproductive division, and what it would be gained from seeing economics and other social sciences as an integrated part of risk assessment, in addition to the historic role it's played in risk management. I'm going to talk today in terms of economic analysis because that's one of the areas I have training in, so it's what I'm familiar with. But I think the argument I have here extends equally well to many areas of social sciences. For example, demography, sociology, areas of psychology that have to do with risk perception. What I'm suggesting is a new paradigm for the role of economics or social sciences in risk analysis. I say new in parentheses because this is not new for some agency offices, but it is for many. And more importantly, it is not yet central to our way of thinking about the structure of risk analysis. In these remarks, I'm expanding on a discussion that was started by Richard Williams and Kim Thompson in a 2004 article in Risk Analysis. They talked about integrating cost-benefit analysis into risk assessment. And while I agree with much of their article, I think that characterization is incorrect. And it's incorrect in a way that underscores a misunderstanding of economics that I think is creating barriers to better risk analysis. So what is economics? Well, I think if you ask most people who are involved in risk assessment, and actually most people who aren't economists, what you'll hear is something that looks like accounting, a form of social accounting to be sure, but it's a form of accounting. At its narrowest, it would be estimation of direct costs of implementation of an engineering solution. It certainly would acknowledge that a role for valuation of the benefits of policy, and it might be as broad as thinking about, yes, there may be indirect effects on the larger society or economy from implementing a particular policy. If you ask economists what they're doing, they'll say that they're behavioral scientists trying to understand individual behavior, whether that individual is a firm or a person, and trying to estimate those behaviors themselves and estimate the interaction that humans and human institutions have through markets or through contracts, as we were hearing this morning, earlier today on insurance contracts. And they might increasingly say that they're interested not only in understanding self-interested, fully informed optimization problems that individuals may be working out, but actually thinking about the role of habit, the role of behavior that's driven by ethical norms such as altruism or bargaining outside of markets in places like the family, and how those affect behavior and response not only to policy but to the environment in which they're living. So, how might a recognition of economics as a behavioral science rather than an accounting exercise change the role of economics in risk analysis? Where might we be going? I think a good place to start is with the 2009 Science and Decision Report from the NRC and look at their basic diagram for where they think we're going with risk analysis and ask, where does human behavior and economic systems play a role in this whole process? And I think the major areas that leap out are in exposure assessment, risk characterization, and of course in risk management. Another thing that leaps out as one reads through this diagram is its emphasis on the estimation of exposure and risk characterization as needing to be under existing conditions. I think there's a danger in this because it can lead analysts to fail to appreciate how quickly current conditions can change in response to factors that may be completely independent of the policy one's concerned about, and that this in turn can lead to a failure to recognize the sources of variability and uncertainty, which certainly the committee emphasizes as being an important area for to take into consideration in risk analysis. I think I'd argue that economics can provide a more structured way to understand and model some of the important sources of this variability and uncertainty. So I want to look now at each of these places where economics may play a role in turn, to give you some examples. I think the area where there's best integration of economics with risk analysis is probably in the area of exposure assessment. I think many agencies really do recognize the role that economic analysis can play here. For example, dietary exposure to pesticides or to mercury in fish are driven by consumption demand. But consumption itself is a dynamic response to many kinds of conditions in markets that changes in conditions in markets that can affect the relative price of alternative foods. For example, the relative affordability of fresh and processed produce in the winter, or the relative prices of wild and farmed fish. And to the extent that each of these different products carry different exposures, you can see, or different contamination levels, you can see very different exposure patterns. Another example of this might be in the estimation of automobile emissions in assessing exposure to common air pollutants. We could model this taking current miles driven and current fuel efficiency of the fleet as given. But these factors in turn really do depend on a complex system of market interactions, consumers' tastes, consumers' needs, auto supply in response to those demands, technological change. All of these put you deep into the terrain that is well studied by economists. Ultimately, risk also turns on behaviors that affect exposure and affect its impact on health. For example, whether people stay indoors during bad air days, or whether they use public transportation on those days. This behavior can depend on things such as the cost of electricity, the availability of air conditioning, whether parents have time to spend supervising their kids and keeping them indoors and entertained indoors, the quality of public transit. So here again, believe it or not, we're well into the terrain where economic modeling can provide some insight. I also want to stress that behind each of these graphs that have been on these slides are a whole series of structural relationships between individual markets, relationships between individual decisions and market demand, and most of economics is about quantitatively modeling these structural relationships. Perhaps one of the most important things that I think economists can do, can bring to risk analysis, is to provide estimates of how people and firms can be expected to respond to different policy options. And so this has been, I think, especially in the solutions-based approach, or in the approach that was developed by Science and Decision with its focus on options, I think this will is now and will continue to be and grow in importance. An example I give is the area of environmental justice, where I think environmental justice policy, my sense is that it often assumes that if a poor neighborhood is cleaned up, then poor people will be healthier. Years of economic analysis of the housing market would suggest, in fact, what you're more likely to see from this change in the public amenities of a neighborhood is a shift in the value of that housing, and a shift, therefore, in the population that's going to inhabit it. And more likely what you'll see is poor people moving out of that neighborhood in search of other housing that fits their budgets and their set of trade-offs, ending in not much change for that population, and suggesting that the option of cleaning up that environment, while laudable in itself, may not be the right solution for breaking the linkage between poverty and poor environmental health. Similarly, in an area I work in on lead paint, there's a great deal that we can add in terms of understanding how parents make decisions about addressing lead paint in the homes. And that is tied to our other social sciences, look at parental risk perceptions, their understanding of hazard processes, but also to the time and budget constraints that families face, and to the way in which conflicts between individual risk perceptions get worked out and negotiated in a family setting. If economics is better integrated into risk assessment, I think one advantage that may be seen is streamlining of the modeling process by the time we get to risk management, because the modeling that can help provide a more accurate model of how risks are generated in a system are also those that you need in evaluating different managerial options, so that it creates a more streamlined process of risk analysis. What would this look like? Well, I think climate change risk assessment is actually has been characterized by very sophisticated integration of economics and scientific analysis. And perhaps here it's easier to see how human behavior and market systems interact with the physical world in affecting the level of health and ecological risks that may be experienced. But this is actually the way it works always in all systems. If you can imagine that a system of quantitative modeling underlying representation of the ocean carbon cycle, imagine that a similar system of modeling lies behind an understanding of all the human activity components of this model. And in fact, that modeling has been done. Does this mean an abandonment of the separation between, the concern about separation between risk management and risk assessment? No, I don't believe so. And I would agree strongly with Richard and Kim's comment that protection is still needed. But what it does recognize is that economics is also a science and a part of the analysis, and to the extent that it's playing a role as scientific analysis, it too needs protection from political influences. The big question, I think, I'd ask next is it worth it? Well, the possible upsides are more accurate and more realistic assessments of risk, and also more seamless interaction between risk assessment and risk management. The possible downsides may be greater complexity in risk assessments and maybe a longer time period, but I don't think we know that until we really try, because it may also lead in having a more complete view of how risks are generated to a more streamlined system, which may end up actually saving us time. I don't think we know yet. So how can we know if it's worth the trouble? I'd suggest a number of steps. First of all, some of this is going on in agencies, and I don't think it's necessarily as clearly recognized as it could be. So I think a first step is a review of existing practices to identify the extent to which we're already seeing integration between economics and the natural and physical sciences in risk assessment. And then I think following on that, an evaluation of selected cases, both of where it is happening and where it isn't, to evaluate both the possible contributions that may be made by this integration as well as barriers to it. And then I think a very important step would be to conduct case studies using a value of information focus to evaluate whether the contribution is worth the additional effort that it would take. On the chance that it is worth it, then I think the following the step to follow on that is to really start to talk about a change in the systematic structure of the way we're thinking about risk analysis and the role of social sciences, economics being one of them, within that system. So with that, I'll move us on to a discussion and then hopefully a chance to talk more.
Mark's got a long line of folks for us already.
Yes, indeed. Remember that the beer's getting warm.
Go ahead, Mark.
Igor Link of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'd like to ask panel about your view on the field of decision analysis and how it relates to risk assessment. In my humble opinion, is that basically all proposals that I hear, except Bernie's, is basically moving from risk assessment to decision analysis. And then why we are reinventing the wheel. Decision analysis is a field of science, has, appropriate formulation and procedures in place. And basically what I hear, it's like repetition of procedures that are already described in the academic community. That could be very helpful.
In a way, I don't think I'm saying anything other than let's wake up and realize that lots of other people make decisions according to a body of craft and knowledge that's been around for centuries, and yet we think we're in that field, but we don't act that way sometimes.
I think you'd agree that risk assessment it would be part of decision analysis.
Question for Sandy Hoffman. Very interesting talk. But just a couple points. Matt Adler at UPenn Law School. First, with respect to whether economics is a social accounting framework as opposed to a behavioral set of models, isn't the answer just that it's both, right? This is the standard distinction between normative economics and positive or explanatory economics, right? There's a vast field of normative economics that gives us and develops normative criteria like Pareto efficiency, Cowdex efficiency, maximizing social welfare function. That goes under the heading of what you're calling a social accounting framework. That's out there. It's useful with respect to risk management, but that's different from the positive, predictive, explanatory part of economics. That's point number one. So it's not one or the other, it's both, but these are different enterprises. The second point is that suggests that maybe, to the extent that you are taking issue with the Williams and Thompson article, which you haven't read, you're really talking past each other. It sounds like from your description they're arguing for incorporating normative economics within risk assessment, which would be a big change, while you're arguing for incorporating economics under its predictive or explanatory aspect within risk assessment, which is not threatening, because your proposal is to take economics as a predictive science, not as a normative framework, and to build that into risk assessment. The third point, though, is that, as you know better than I, economics under this behavioral, predictive, social scientific aspect is to some extent in a state of disarray, right, signaled by the fact that Jan Kahneman won the Nobel Prize. That is to say, the old model, the old predictive set of models, which the neoclassical models, which, focus around things like, the notion that individuals maximize expected utility, right, standard general equilibrium models and so forth, right, those have been exploded, right, by lots of evidence that have led to things like loss aversion, some of what you alluded to, right, habit formation, framing, and so forth. And it would be nice, it would be very useful to incorporate all that within risk assessment. But the problem is, I take it, that stuff has not coalesced yet around a standard set of models that, or arguably, react to this. Has this new post-neoclassical economics coalesced around a standard set of models that could be incorporated in risk assessment the way that, for example, standard dose response models or exposure assessment models are? It's something that really is the question that I think you should, may want to grapple with.
Okay. On a number of these, thank you for bringing up the distinction between normative and positive economics. And that's exactly what I was talking about when I said there's a role yet, that I'm not abandoning the role for economics in risk management. And you're exactly right that there is economics as social accounting, and I think it's the normative criteria that we have are part of that, and that belongs in risk management. But what I've seen is that because there's such a focus on that, particularly I think outside of the economics literature, that there has been a tendency to think that that's all that economics is, and that the positive kind of what most economists do most of the time, which is estimate demand and supply curves and understand how markets are interacting, try to study individual behavior, try to understand individual behavior within firms, that doesn't get the attention and needs to be brought into risk assessment, because a very big part of how risks are generated is human behavior. So if we're ignoring modeling human behavior and what we know about it, we're not getting the kind of of assessments that we need to understand why people are at risk. So that's what I'm arguing for, is that there's a piece that's been missing. I think it's arguable whether economics is in disarray. There are directions for opening economics and moving beyond neoclassical kinds of assumptions about full information and rationality. I think, in fact, when I look at most of applied economics, I think we're well beyond that. I also think that most of what needs to be added a lot of what could be added to risk assessment falls well within the domain of pretty standard positive economics. So I think that there's a lot that can be done without worrying about irrational models with irrationality. That said, those models there's been probably a couple of decades of work on that kind of model, and I think that there's a lot that can be brought in.
Just one quick follow-up to what Sandy said. I think one practical endorsement of what she's saying. I think a real crying need for behavioral economics would be in the risk-risk trade-off idea. That, in my experience when I used to be at the agencies, that this is 10 years ago, but basically any risk-risk trade-off that was put forward in a regulatory proceeding was accepted as legit. And so if we had at the time the tools of behavioral economics to say, wait a minute, this purported perverse effect of Regulation A will simply not occur because no rational profit-maximizing firm would ever do that in response to the regulation, we would have had a lot easier time.
I think about my own field of agricultural economics, where we've dealt with non-profit maximizing models for a very long time, because you have to if you look at farm behavior. Often a farmer is more concerned about, for instance, survival than they are about maximizing profit. So they're very risk averse. So those models, to some extent, are out there.
I'm Warner North. I'd like to greet the three people on the panel I know so well. We've worked on National Academy studies together. And it's a pleasure to hear from Sandra Hoffman. But as a member of the committee that wrote the Red Book, I want to address some comments to you and give you some history that you may not know. And then I'm going to find myself agreeing strongly with Adam Finkel, but we'll argue that, we usually argue, but this time I'm in agreement. I'm just going to ask that you add a citation to page 3940 in the Red Book, which explains that risk assessment has to be adapted to the risk management problem. We said emphatically on those pages that risk assessment should not be done the same way all the time. It has to be adapted to the problem. Now, we might have said that in a little bit more detail. When we started the Red Book Committee, we were asked to look at a proposal for a science court that had come out of an industry association. Our committee dismissed in the first meeting that the science court was a workable idea. We then focused on what could we say to the federal agencies, there were 4 of them that our report was addressed to, about process issues for making risk assessment more defensible and helping the federal government to learn how to do it. For example, having guidelines. And we did an assessment of what federal agency practice was in the 4 agencies. And figure 2.1 from your presentation, Sandra, was actually a description of how EPA was doing risk assessment at the time that our committee was meeting. It is not original. Maybe it was news to a lot of people that a National Academy of Sciences committee blessed that paradigm, but we certainly didn't originate it. And if you read 3940 and other pages in our report, we clearly intended that risk managers and risk assessors should talk starting early and continuing often. We never intended that there be a one-way flow of first do the risk assessment and then do the risk management. Then there is the issue of what did we say about the relationship between risk assessment and risk management. Our words were conceptual distinction. They were not separation. Separation was brought in by an administrator at the EPA, William Ruckelshaus, who was dealing with a political situation in which he was trying to restore the agency's credibility. And so he emphasized separation, that is, keeping the political elements that enter into risk management out of the risk assessment. He was perhaps too enthusiastic, but maybe those nuances were lost on most people. I'm going to phrase the question and comments on this. So, Adam, I'd love to have you reference the Red Book with 3940. And Sandra, I hope you will pick up on this history. The reason the committee did not go further into risk management, incidentally, is that William Nordhaus was originally on the committee and dropped out, and he originated analysis such as in your slide 10. So we didn't have the time and the will to do the risk management side in that report. So I'm trying to add a few comments as to what really happened in my role as the historical memory here. With Bernie's comment, I hope you're going to include in public health the idea of individualizing it now that we're learning about genetic differences. How people react to ozone exposure varies enormously depending on the conditions of their health, what subgroup they might fall into. And it seems to me that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind rather than do calculations based on the population of the United States or a small group, but ask how many people are sensitive to ozone. And finally, to Gail, I would ask you to add to your National Academy citations the recent one that Steve Lewis and I and others worked on, Public Participation in Environmental Assessment and Decision-Making, which also stresses the need for a problem formulation at the beginning and for good use of science, getting the science right and the right science in the words of the 1996 Understanding Risk Report. So that's an extended comment. Welcome your comments on the panel on discussion of these subjects over cocktails. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually torn between speaking and just running over and getting a cocktail. First of all, Gail, I want to applaud your notion that we ought to start using performance measures. The agencies have been resistant to doing that. They're hard to do. They're hard to sort of say. But I want to just answer this question, is risk assessment broken? And my answer is it depends on who's making the risk assessors do what they do. If it's the law that's requiring a safety analysis like a reference dose or an acceptable daily intake or whatever, then the law is broken. If it's just convention, then it's the convention of the agencies. Because, as you all have pointed out, if you're just doing a safety analysis and that is the decision, no other things are allowed to come into the decision, then you're not handling the risk trade-offs that cut across the agencies, that cut across the laws. You're not handling costs, and then that is the problem. So is risk assessment broken? It depends on what's making them do just safety analyses, which I believe worldwide is probably 80 to 90% of what's passing for risk assessment.
Thanks, Richard. Go ahead.
I'm not sure in your comment whether you think that's good or bad that a local manager can use the risk assessment as a way to determine whether or not they should follow up on something. I think it's a very useful tool that's been provided.
It's a useful tool if it's used as a screening device. But at the moment it begins to attenuate a technology or change something, then the risk assessor should be there to point out, you know what, and the economist, there's a lot of other things that you need to consider. This shouldn't be the be-all, end-all.
Sure, and this goes for everything. We've heard some wonderful things about global climate, but I will tell you that probably half the driving force in global climate is population growth. So if you really want to do something about global climate, then you've got to empower women around the world so there'll be less population growth. You never see that kind of analysis. So I would argue that there's an enormous amount of analyses that need to be done that cut across broad public health focuses that we simply aren't doing.
Excuse me, there's more than two. There's more than the women that are involved.
But if But no, yes, I do. Because if you empower women, then you end up with fewer kids.
Okay.
Hi. I'm reminded a little bit listening to all these presentations, and especially the last statement, that the French absurdist playwright Ionesco has a character shout at everyone at one point, "One must always be thinking of everything." And that's sort of the advice I'm hearing here. And it's interesting. I'm a well-read, holistic fellow. This is fine. But when I return to the office Wednesday morning, I've got a stack of 24 economic analyses to complete. I would urge you to do two things. One, to think of when it is important to think of certain kinds of things and when you can ignore them. And second, almost everything I've heard has been about health assessment. It seems to me there's something to be gained by asking, with the very different data available for safety, do we do better, worse, differently, and how? Before you say, for example, someone urged, we need a really good public health assessment system that pulls in more and better data. For many safety areas, we have that kind of data. Has it made the difference you think it would make on public health?
Well, obviously, data themselves are not going to solve. I mean, I think implicit in those statements, I don't want to speak for Sandy, but it would be gather data and then react to it properly. I think we have plenty of safety data that we simply don't have the will to follow through with safe actions. And in terms of think of everything, you know me, I'm a big proponent of multi-billion-dollar decisions should be supported by multi-thousand-dollar analyses. And I wish you had more time and more colleagues and more money to do more, but I also think that a lot of what the agencies end up spending their time on is mandatory angels on the head of a pin, which detracts from time that could be spent thinking about what's the best way to protect consumers and workers from the hazards of dry cleaning clothes rather than what is the potency of PERC. You don't have to spend as much time on the latter if you spend more time on the former.
All right, I think we're wrapping up. No more questions? All right, great. We have a reception outside. We're going to start at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.